Ko te taonga he mea kei te tangata e mau ana, nāna ake, nōna ake rānei. He mea e kai ngā kautiana, he nui rānei te utu, kaore rānei e tino kitea. A taonga is something possessed by a person or belongs to them. It is something of importance, quantifiable perhaps of financial value, or is rarely seen. Welcome to the Taonga Files, the podcast that reconnects whakapapa, mātauranga, and the journeys of Taonga Māori. Ko migoto iria ahau.
Ko Amber Aranui tēnei, through research, Taonga speak, revealing where they've travelled, who they've touched, and what they carry.
So let's step beyond the register as we uncover stories that shape who we are.
These stories were never lost. They were just waiting to be found. Kia ora tātou and welcome to the Taonga Files. This season we're diving into taonga that sit inside colonial systems, including objects that weren't made for us, yet ended up holding our stories. Today's episode is one of those. On the surface, it's just a big old ledger from 1878. But like many things from that era, what it carries and who it connects is far from ordinary. To open up this kaupapa, I'm joined by my friend and co-host, Migoto Iria, who knows this ledger more intimately than most. And rather than give too much away, I'm going to let her reveal its secrets. Migoto, e hoa, what exactly is this taonga and how did you come upon it? And before you kind of dive in, what was the very first moment that made you think, this is something special?
There's a bit of journey to that, e hoa. So when I was preparing an exhibition at MTG Hawke's Bay, which means Museum, Theatre and Gallery in Hawke's Bay, which is really just the Hawke's Bay Museum, in 2012, I'd discovered the archival collection in that museum was pretty amazing, particularly regarding Māori newspapers and William Colenso's archive when he was producing a Māori dictionary. I found an issue of the Māori newspaper Te Wananga in the collection database, and of course when you're looking at something of interest in a collection database, you can see other items that are directly relevant to what you're looking at, and this is how I found the Te Wananga ledger. So this is an example of your non-typical taonga, and unless you truly knew what it was or its purpose, then I guess it just looks like a boring old book. But in keeping with the kaupapa of colonial objects in a specific time period, I thought about this kaupapa when I wrote about it back in 2012 for an exhibition I was doing at MTG Hawke's Bay, which is where this taonga comes from.
I have to say I have a love and appreciation for old books and ledgers, and I can imagine, what it was like to hold and even smell something of this age. Can you take us into that room for a second? What did it feel like to sit with this taonga? Was there a particular name that stopped you in your tracks?
So back then, I'd spent a lot of time poring over this ledger to fully grasp its purpose, and I was quite drawn to it. Each time I went into the collection store to get it out, it was very heavy and big, and if you know what I look like and how tall I am, it would look even bigger. So I needed to always prepare a space on a table and nestle it on a large cushion to take the pressure off the spine when I turned the pages. I enjoyed looking at the pages with handwritten names of Tipuna Māori from 1878, and actually the smell. It had that ancient book smell. And I'm just trying to bring the listeners as close as possible to the experience. It didn't not smell, it did smell.
I can imagine it.
Yeah. So just a bit of visuals here. Inside of the bound covers they're decorated with beautiful, colourful marbling, which is also featured on the edging of the pages. So when the book is shut, you can see the decorative marbling. The technical names are also known as the top edge, the fore edge, and the bottom edge. I had to look that up, I'm just saying.
I didn't know that.
So the spine, from memory, has Te Wananga embossed, which would make it easy to find, of course, if it's stored on a shelf. So the ledger originally would have been purchased new and empty, of course, as a hardbound office ledger in the 1870s from Dinwiddie, Morrison & Co. stationers in Napier.
What surprised you most the very first time you turned those pages?
So the inside pages are set up in two sections, one with numeric tabs, like numbers, and the other with alphabetic tabs, so like A, B, C, D, and so forth, all the way to Z, all at the foredge. So, and each individual tab alternating between black and red. Now, if you see it in person, you will understand why it alternates between black and red if you need to go back to look at a certain page. Names of individuals, mostly Māori, are handwritten visibly by the same hand, by first or surname, or at times only one name, and each name has a number written alongside. If you follow the corresponding number to the numeric section of the ledger, you will find that person's address. So in regards to whose handwriting it belongs to, I don't know this, and it's not recorded anywhere, and there are about roughly 900 names recorded.
All right. Do you think the people who had their names in this book understood the significance of what was being created at the time?
I'm not too sure. The printers of that newspaper, of course, are going to have to record your name and know where you live. I don't know if those people knew exactly that their names were in this ledger, but there would have been a way for the printers to hold that information, the names and the addresses and so forth.
So that's been a non-typical taonga in thinking about the interests of researchers and specifically uri, or descendants. What was the purpose of this ledger?
So I needed to sort of refresh my memory a little bit about this kaupapa, and I'd written an article about it for the book called The Lives of Colonial Objects back in 2015. And I'd also checked MTG Hawke's Bay's website. Both of these sources are accessible to public, and we'll include a link in the show notes. But this ledger is better known as the Te Wananga ledger. It was like an address book for subscribers to the Te Wananga newspaper. There weren't things like phones, of course, or phone books at the time. And the date noted for the ledger is 1878. A little side note, the first telephone call in New Zealand was in February 1878 between Dunedin and Milton, nowhere near Napier.
Is that close to somewhere where Monica is?
Probably not far from Wānanga. But if we think back to that time and how the sharing of information was done, newspapers were currency. And like subscriptions as we understand them today, this was a niche group of people with a particular interest in the Te Wananga newspaper's content, which I'll talk about shortly. But yes, the purpose of the ledger is a list of names and corresponding addresses for subscribers in the year of 1878.
Okay, so you're saying this newspaper and communications like these were written in Te Reo Māori. So Te Reo Māori obviously was still widely spoken at the time. 1878 we know was a transitional period with a rapid decline of the Māori population following the land wars, and Pākehā population was also rising significantly. So printed news in Te Reo Māori was obviously really important, with critical information for the population at the time. I wonder how many of our people were literate at that time, and that's not a negative connotation at all. Going back and thinking largely as a result of the work of missionary schools, were set up quite early. People like Colenso in the Hawke's Bay were there teaching our tupuna to read and write. So yeah, I find that quite fascinating. Also, we know that the Native Schools Act was created in 1867, and that was also pushing English only to be learnt. With Te Reo Māori being banned in the classroom and on the playground, this generation would come to push the kind of assimilation agenda themselves because this is what they were taught. This is about 30 years before the Tohunga Suppression Act as well. And it would have been that generation that was forced to learn English that were affected by that Tohunga Suppression Act. So tell us about the Te Wananga newspaper and what was its focus? I guess also who started it? Who subscribed? We know that there are over 900 entries in there, so a lot of people.
Yeah, no, pātai pai te raihoa. Te Wananga newspaper ran from 1874 in Pakowhai, which is a place in Hawke's Bay, to 1878 in Napier. published by Henare Tomoana and Henry Hill. The first editions were in Māori, and later editions were in both Māori and English. At this time, thousands of our people were literate and would have been keen to read relevant news in Te Reo Māori. In 1875, the cost for subscription published weekly was 20 shillings per annum, posted 22 shillings 6 pence, single copies from newsagents 6 pence. So this translates to, in today's currency, $150 per annum. Single copies would be $5.
Yes. Actually, just to kind of interject on that, you said Henry Hill was involved. You and I both know who he was and his legacy. But I think it's important that you share with the listeners who this man is and why it's important here. And perhaps we'll talk about him in future episodes. But do you think he saw himself as an ally, or was he operating maybe from a different agenda?
Hey, look, I think there's a lot to characters like Henry Hill that sort of lies unknown. I didn't know who he was. I don't have accounts or seen accounts of his family writing about him. However, listeners might recognise the names of Henry Hill and Henry Wilson from episode 2. Henry Wilson was also the editor of another Māori newspaper, Te Waka Māori or Nutirani. Both Henrys are known to have collected taonga. And from what I've found in the issues of Te Wananga I've seen, Henry Hill has been an administrator. The issues would advertise for any printing, end quote, of all descriptions at the cheapest rates are at the Wānanga office, Hastings Street, Napier. Orders to be given to Henry Hill at the Wānanga office. And what that looked like in Māori sounds like this. Ko ngā mahi katoa o te tā pukapuka e mahi ana i te wharetā o te Wānanga i heitingi tiriti Napier. Me tuku mai auatu mahi kia henare hira i te tari o te Wānanga. I guess listen out for more kōrero about Henry Hill, definitely in upcoming episodes.
Okay, let's focus back on the Te Wananga newspaper for a minute. What was the newspaper wanting to achieve during this time in our history? Was there a strategy behind its creation? And emotionally, what do you think our tupuna were feeling when they were reading these articles about land loss and political pressure?
So the aim of the Te Wananga newspaper was to unite iwi Māori over land matters, discussing, selling and leasing, mortgages, reserves and Crown grants. It was also known as the mouthpiece of the repudiation movement in the 1870s, which sought to overturn fraudulent sales of Ngāti Kahungunu lands and also reported on controversial land cases. So the repudiation movement included leadership by Henare Matua, who later became involved in the kotahitanga movement. The repudiation movement was known to be primarily active roughly between 1871 and 1879. More recently, research about the movement has been conducted at Eastern Institute of Technology Hawke's Bay, namely by David Tipene Leach and Waitangi Tepa. The kaupapa of Te Wananga, although primarily kahungunu-based, was consistent with what was happening throughout the Motu. Some subscribers were from outside the rohe as well, and in the very first issue of Te Wananga it announced in the reo translation that this is a press for the whole island for Māori people, and it has been entitled Te Wananga for all the present-day tribes. In the manner of the press, it will bring us to a consensus of opinion, hence the title Te Wananga, because it is an asset for us all. So the newspaper invited information from all iwi, where the government or individuals were purchasing or leasing land. Māori landholders could advertise their land leases so that everyone, including Pākehā, could identify land available for lease and how to contact Māori landowners. The newspaper allowed grievances to be aired publicly to assist people seeking redress. In one issue, Te Wananga stated in Māori, ko tā mātou hiahia kia puta te pai ki ngā iwi katoa o ēnei whenua ahakoa Māori, ahakoa Pākehā, kia kore ai he amuamu a aua tangata kia rātou. And this is more or less saying We are anxious to do justice to both races, allay any irritation that may arise, and engender mutual feelings for forbearance and goodwill.
Why is this ledger important in terms of record keeping? And if you can share with us more about those who subscribed, like what do we know about them? I'm wondering, have you ever had someone find their tupuna in this ledger, and what was that moment like?
Yes, I think so, Ehua. And I think if you are, especially if you are from Kahungunu or Tairāwhiti rohe, or you have a particular interest in this sort of history and kōrero, the Te Wananga ledger created a record for a different purpose, and many of the subscribers were prominent representatives of iwi and hapū authorities. Other than the likes of the ledger, there wasn't a lot of record keeping of Māori names at that specific time. Missionaries documented some Māori births and deaths in church records, but Māori were not generally recorded in the official register until 1913. Among the names are well-known individuals such as Horomona Pōhio, Henare Matua, Herini Te Kani, but also a few Pākehā names such as William Colenso and Sir George Grey. And I think it's quite interesting that all these people were around all at the same time. And many of the individuals in the ledger were, of course, involved in the repudiation movement, as well as others affected by land sales. And those with an interest in Māori land sales, local government officials, lawyers and politicians. Have you ever had someone find their tipuna in this ledger? I think this is the whole purpose why years later I'm still talking about it, because I think it's completely untapped. I really want the whānau of the likes of Henare Matua, Herini Te Kani and so forth to, come and look for their tupuna's name, because I think I've only really experienced that for myself.
Wow. Yeah, like you say, an untapped taonga, definitely. Just going back to some of the people who feature in this ledger, you talked about George Grey and William Colenso. What were they doing in this ledger? And, being the person I am, were they there gathering intel? And actually, what does this tell you about these men that we're reading the same newspaper as our tipuna?
Well, it's interesting because it's, seeing their names, it tells you a little bit more of the context and the culture at the time, right? So I think, the likes of Grey and Colenso and also our mate Henry Hill were clearly invested. As to exactly why from each of those men, I wouldn't know. However, in 1878, Grey was still in the role of Premier of New Zealand. And interestingly, both Colenso and Henry Hill were both school inspectors in Hawke's Bay at the same time. In 1878, that was the year that Te Wananga ceased publication. So I think we're fortunate to have this record capturing this information beforehand. At this time in 1878, the transfer of Māori land to non-Māori was a threat to Māori landowners. The repercussions for the mana of the people through land loss was alarming. Rangatira were no longer rangatira. Uri whakatipu or descendants could no longer interact with their whenua ūkaipō. So the repudiation movement and Te Wananga were a line of defence. The ledger's initial purpose was to employ a European business practice to distribute the newspaper to subscribers, as we understand today, and to provide them with information about other such practices. It mediated between Māori and Pākehā worlds and interests.
Wow, such an important taonga and an important, capturing of a point in time. Wow. So when did this ledger actually come into the museum and who was its donor? And also, do you think the people who handled it over the years really understood its significance, or is that something we're just realising now?
I think just now, Ehua, this is part of that kōrero. I mean, the ledger's journey is unrecorded after 1878, but it was gifted to the then Hawke's Bay Museum in 1960 by Mrs. Gaisford. And information found through the Knowledge Bank in Hastings and also in the Māori Land Court Minute Book suggest Mr. Henry Gaisford, and honestly, this is the third Henry, come on, and William Gaisford, and both of whom lived in Hawke's Bay at one time, and particularly around 1878. But as to their association to the said Mrs. Gaisford, I guess that could be another kōrero altogether. Its significance has altered in the last 148 years. It's now a thing of intrinsic value to present to generations, a window into the lives of our tipuna, and a source of empowerment and identity. The ledger invites us to look for our tipuna names and to feel represented within the discussion of mana whenua. Physical proof of our tipuna's interest in the subject of whenua.
Okay, I have so many questions about what was going on at the time, the loss of land, the repudiation movement, and the role of Te Tiriti o Waitangi during that period. That is a whole other kōrero, I think, for a future episode. But before we close, if the ledger could speak directly to its uri today, what do you think it might say? What message would you like to share with our listeners regarding the Te Wananga ledger? And lastly, what does this ledger teach us about the resilience of our people?
In terms of what this ledger could say directly to its uri today is that, this mahi has a legacy. Our mana motuhake and our rangatiratanga didn't just start last year or 2 years ago. It's been happening for a long time. And I think that's the message. That's what we learn from records like this. We have the opportunity to extend its story, to shed some light on its history, and bring it to the attention of its uri whakatipu for the first time. At the beginning of this episode is the definition of taonga, from the dictionary he pātaka kupu. Even though the ledger isn't your typical taonga Māori, such as a mere, Taiaha or Kākahu, it is hoped that generations to come are able to see themselves represented in their tipuna's names. If this has sparked any curiosity and you're interested in going to see the ledger, I'm sure you could contact MTG Hawke's Bay to view it if it isn't on display.
Ehua, thank you for opening this ledger for us today. We began with the idea that taonga are things that hold meaning and identity, and you've shown us how even a non-typical taonga like this ledger carries real mana. These pages captured Māori names at a time when our people were barely recognised in official records. They held the voices of those navigating land loss, political pressure, and the fight to protect their whenua. And now, generations later, this ledger becomes a window back to our tipuna, restoring visibility, reconnecting whakapapa, and reminding us that our stories were always here. Ngā mihi nui ki a koe Migoto for bringing this kaupapa to life with such depth and aroha. You've been listening to the Taonga Files. Don't forget to follow, like and subscribe to the pod wherever you get your podcast fix. Head to our socials and send us your comments or even things you want us to look into. We look forward to sharing the next file with you. Ka kite anō.